I'm joined by Sergio Porta, the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow in the UK. And Sergio, we were talking about your remarkable work on plot-based urbanism, your curriculum development. You're a man of many talents. Can you just tell us a little bit about your current work, what you're up to these days?
Well, yes, indeed. We have been developing for a few years now a significant work, I think, on the idea of cities, of actually trying to understand how cities change. And because we are urban designers, we are interested in the urban form, and so understanding how the urban form changes and interpreting the urban form, the physical aspect of cities as themselves a complex adaptive environment system, and therefore changing according to certain rules that have been acknowledged and identified for all complex systems in nature, society, knowledge, culture, everything basically. So using this paradigm to interpret cities and how they change allows us to sort of rethink about our profession as urban designers and our main tool that identifies our profession, which is the master plan. Now, we are living in a period of transformation of that. So from an idea of the master plan like a grand blueprint, a fixed idea of how a city should develop and become in X number of years, towards an idea of the future of cities as a constant change and development in time. And that changes everything. In the way we think of cities, in the way we think of the people living in cities. And our effort is to try to do that scientifically and therefore, analyzing, observing quantitatively how things go in cities and draw conclusions regarding urban form, which is basically what we have to do as urban designers.
I know you've been heavily influenced by Christopher Alexander, as have I, and we've talked about this many times. You've been involved, I know, in some curriculum development around his work. Can you tell us a little bit not only about the Building Beauty program, but perhaps your larger work around some of Chris Alexander's work?
Well, there are two things in particular which I'm happy to address. One, the difference
Please,
is...
I'm sorry to interrupt. Mention the name Chris Alexander.
I remember that.
Take it from there. Yeah.
And by the way, don't swing too much, right? Because I think that
effectively, there are two aspects in the theory of Chris Alexander that I've been keen to investigate, and what distinguishes these two aspects is basically the scale, not just the scale, the spatial scale, but also the temporal scale. So the time which is involved in the element of change. So the two these two things I've been developing in terms of education in the past years. The first one is more recent, actually, the one about the small scale of development, the scale in time again, so development of the building, the development of the street, but not really the development of a part of a town or part of a city. So, and that is called Building Beauty, that we are now with a number of friends that belong to the inner circle of Chris Alexander group, but also go far beyond that. And that is in Sorrento at the moment in Italy, and it is about making. It is about making things, from little things, so pottery, ceramics, or furniture, to larger things, including up to the scale of the building. And that is one thing. The other thing is about urban design again, urban design, which means again how things change in cities, and this is the larger scale. But actually, the two dimensions are unified by the same concept, which is an evolutionary concept, according to which the quality that we are looking for doesn't necessarily come by design. Actually, it doesn't. At least it doesn't completely. So an important part of the process that creates the quality is not a process of design. Actually happens after the design phase, in what we have learned to call the post-design phase. And a number of things that normally are not part of the curriculum of architects and architecture come to stage, because when you shift your attention from the design phase to the post-design phase, then you need innovation in what you teach.
So one of the themes that has recurred in our discussions with other people is this idea of top-down and bottom-up, top-down versus bottom-up. And it seems to me that what you're describing and what Chris Alexander has been describing is another paradigm, if you will, as John Close has put it, the head of UN Habitat, former head, that we need to rethink how top-down can engage bottom-up, if you will, how the large-scale master planning can empower the informal growth of neighborhoods and of people's needs, meeting people's needs, including the need for beauty and the need for sensory experiences and all the things that make a city livable, make a city a great place to live. What are your thoughts about how this process works and how we as implementers of the new urban agenda need to think differently, perhaps?
Well, in terms of we have to distinguish between the design phase and the post-design phase. We have been always obsessed by the design phase as designers, that's understandable. But in terms of this interpretation of the top-down versus bottom-up things and how these two things should work together, it is really important to distinguish the two phases, because if we look out of the window and we look at the reality of the world, we observe the world. It's obvious and it is evident that some of the best places that have proved to be continuously successful in time have been designed, and have been designed sometimes in a very brutal way. If you think, for example, of Victorian planning, the planning which generated some of the most beautiful places in all our towns, which happened in 19th century up to the first decades of the 20th century. But those things are still nowadays probably the most successful in many cases, in most cases, of the most successful areas of our towns. And those have been heavily planned. And very often they have been planned around, for example, street structures which are grid iron shaped. And so this really sounds some odd at some point when you think of Chris Alexander, but actually if you look at Chris Alexander's work more in depth, you will see that he acknowledged that, and he acknowledges that in a very clear way. So what is natural in the sense that resembles in the way the city changed, the way living organisms change, doesn't necessarily end up with sort of curvilinear shapes. This is a very superficial way of intending the matter. What really counts is the system of relationships between spaces at different scales. Again, from the small scale to the large scale, which means from the bottom up to the top down. And these two things work together in nature and in cities.
Well, I remember you and I discussing the cadastral plans of Muratori, a famous study of Venice, and how it started out as quite a simple, regular plan, and then, of course, over time became incredibly complex and intricate, and that was because of all the little actions of different people changing and adapting and creating that rich tapestry over time. Isn't that what somehow we have to get back to that kind of?
No, absolutely. The real force there is what we call informal participation. And by informal participation, we mean the participation of people, families, and small, medium organizations into the change of the built environment by pursuing their own goals. It's a very evolutionary way of understanding that.
So how would you describe, I know another major area of your work is what you call plot-based urbanism. How would you describe that briefly?
Well, it is definitely...
Please say, plot-based urbanism is...
Well, effectively, plot-based urbanism is definitely the outcome of all what we've been talking about in terms of design and urban design and master planning. It is about the importance of the small plots which develop independently from each other, at least to some degree. Now, it is true that having small plots developing independently from each other is not enough. You need to coordinate, to orchestrate at some level certain features of the space and also certain features of the processes that undertake, that govern the development of spaces. But nevertheless, it is incredibly important that the fine grain of the city is identified in terms of small plots. How small, how big, this is another conversation, but they need to be kind of small, by and large. This is really important, and to distinguish real plot-based urbanism, which comes from history, by the way, it is the way our cities have always been developing, from some recent sort of fake plot-based urbanism efforts. What distinguishes the two, I think, is really the level of independency, of autonomously. The plots can change autonomously from each other, meaning that the people in control of the single plot, they also control the construction, the development of the buildings within that plot, and the relationship that plot creates with the adjacent plots and the street and public space and so on.
And a related area that I know you've worked on, and I've had the privilege of working with you on it, is what you've called the 400-meter rule, the idea that there are naturally occurring regular spacings of principal arterials. And can you tell us just briefly about
Well, we need to understand how cities work, very simply. Like if we were doctors, we would look at people, at our patients, and see and try to understand how that particular body works or that particular individual. We need to do the same with cities, understanding how cities work, and then having our interventions working with them, not against them, not from other ideologies or abstract theories or ideas, but from actual theories of how cities work in practice. And the 400 meters rule is one of those things, because we spent a lot of time observing cities. Now we can do that because we are the first generation that can do that from our desk, because we have Google Street View, we have Google Map, we have a number of big data repositories which are available to us, basically for free, and we're the first generation in history that can actually use that information. And we have spent a lot of time observing and measuring cities of all sorts, big, small, from the north, from the south of the world, from the plains, from the top of the mountains, the rich cities, poor cities, Islamic cities, Catholic cities, and there is a level where they share basically the same stuff, and the 400 meters rule is one of those things that are shared in most cases after the Second World War. And then something happened there that actually changed the stage and changed the results. So the cities after the Second World War, on the ground, not on paper, on the ground, have been developed in quite profoundly different ways.
That's the term you use, the alterations in scale.
The alterations in scale,
come from
yes.
the CM model and so on.
Yeah, the idea is that if you just observe, we have observed a number of things, but if you just fix your eyes on the distance between the main streets, not all the streets, but only the main streets, if you look at how far away they cross each other, and you look at all those cities before the Second World War, from all the different parts of the world, they basically cross each other at about 300, 400 meters of distance. And when you look at the samples of cities after the Second World War, especially those that have been planned, that distance doubles, and sometimes it gets 3 times larger. And then, interestingly, if you look at the informal settlements created in the last 20, 30, so after the Second World War, the informal settlements come back to the pre-modern rule, which means something, because of course the informal settlements are informal because they've never been planned. So that leads us to conclude that perhaps the impact that the ideologies of planning and more in general the planning profession, that impact that we have generated on cities on the ground has been immense. Actually, our responsibilities in creating the sort of second species of cities emerged after the Second World War are very significant.
Immense and immensely problematic in many ways.
And very problematic.
So I want to ask you as a final thought, you're here at the World Urban Forum, as we all are, thinking about implementing the new urban agenda, which has many of the ideals you just described. What do you see as the big concerns, the big challenges that we're facing right now?
Well, I think the urban agenda, for the first time, has posed the theme of the public space right at the center of the various themes: quality and equality of the communities, participation of the communities, and prosperity, of course, a generational prosperity through time. All of that has been sort of gathered around this axis, which is the quality of the public space in time. And we see for the first time this element so central in this kind of documents. And I can see, I have seen at the World Urban Forum this coming up all the times. So apparently there has been a good response from the delegates regarding this theme in various possible ways. Now this is the central theme, I think, for the next decade or so, because public spaces are actually the theater, they are the stage where everything happens, and even the private part of the land is related to the public part in such a significant ways, not just at the outset, but again in the way they evolve in time. So the way even the private land uses, for example, evolve is inherently linked with the centrality of streets, for example, which is a character of the public space.
Sergio Porta, thank you very much.
Thank you.